Higher ed in Canada is, as you know, at a critical inflection point. We've got financial pressures, demographic shifts, political headwinds, and global competition. All these we know are reshaping the sector. And so we're hopping on this video to quickly discuss a little bit about how institutions can not just survive, but thrive. And so, Anna, just to kick us off, when you think about the Canadian higher ed landscape today, what words come to mind for you?
Stalled, uncertain, wanting for innovation. Is that a word?
It's a few, but it works. And so, how do you see the financial pressures, these demographic shifts, and the political scrutiny affecting the sector differently now than maybe they did even 5 years ago?
I mean, I think we've had some pretty sudden decisions like the cap on international students that have really weakened the financial footing of our institutions in Canada. But I also think there's maybe more of a general, maybe slightly more globalized trend about people questioning what is the value of higher education, especially university education. And I think that has to do with the kind of economic situation we're in right now, but also some of the cultural dynamics and political dynamics that are happening here, there, and everywhere. Um, so I think it's a complex picture, but I think it's one where I feel like clever institutions are starting to reconcile themselves to it not being maybe as certain a future as they might have felt it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe even a couple of years ago. But I think there is maybe a lingering question or not enough questions about what do we do about it? How do we make that secure footing? Is it just about, reinstating government funding, reinstating international students at the same rate that we had them before because they were propping up our institutions financially? Or is it about coming up with new, maybe more resilient models for how these organizations and institutions can thrive into the future? Having said that, I think the questions and the conversations feel nascent to me here.
Yeah. And just building on what you just said, you talk about resilience as key to thriving through disruption. But what does true institutional resilience look? I mean, it's a buzzword, right? So what does it really look like to you in a higher ed institution?
I think when I think about resilience, I think about ecosystems in the environment. And I think about, are we positioned to thrive or not? And I think in universities and colleges, I think that has to do like maybe the center point of it is, are we relevant and are we offering something to the people that we serve, whether those people are students, researchers, grantors, communities, governments, that they really want and need and understand the true value of. And so I think in higher ed, the anchor point for resilience is relevance, actually. And I think that relevance or value proposition needs to be reimagined or at least re-explained for the current moment, you know? Um, and I think people's hearts and minds need to be re-engaged about what is the purpose of higher education? Why do we need it? Why is it so important in our society? So I think there's one part of this resilience equation is about why are we here and why does it matter? But then I think there's another part that's about how do we make these institutions and the kind of organizational structures within them, how do we make them work for 2025 and beyond? How do we make them financially sustainable? How do we make the cost of getting a degree like achievable for the average person and maybe even a person that's struggling? How do we make this a tool for our future in a different way? And I think there's a risk right now that we're slipping into a conversation about higher education being like the purview of the elite and there being like other avenues to growth. I would love to see a more integrated idea where like you can go to university, you can go to college and just like open your mind and learn how to think and also find really beautiful, meaningful pathways to work. And those things may overlap and they may not, but they both have a really important value in our society. Right now, I think that value proposition is in question. And so I think the resilience of the institutions is in question. And I think when you think about that word, you're right, it's a buzzword, but it's about are they built to last? Are they structured right now to stand the test of time? Are they strong enough to withstand the headwinds that are coming at them? And there are lots of headwinds right now.
Yeah. So, given that this conversation we're having about resilience isn't new, it's not the only one being had, what do you think are some of the misconceptions that higher ed leaders have about resilience, what it feels like, what it looks like to build it?
I think higher education leaders have the misconception that they can assert resilience. Okay. And I say that because I have read too many institutional plans, strategies, communications that just sort of claim value creation rather than demonstrating value creation. And I know there's an enormous amount of value producing work that exists in our higher education landscape, but I think oftentimes it's packaged up and sold to the public by people that are far removed from the grassroots of the work, from the work that touches everyday real human beings. And so I think, like any other kind of organizational idea trend, you know, there's a risk that we package resilience up into a sort of tick box exercise where we can just assert our resilience as leaders of a powerful institution, when in reality, I think resilience needs to be explored and considered by the very many different types of people that live and work and learn in our higher education institutions. And they need to tell us, what about this place is working and not? What about this place is fit for the future or may not be? And we also need to go into those external stakeholder populations and have some bigger conversations about what should higher ed look like in the next 5 years, the next 10 years? What do we need it to accomplish in our society and our democracy? Um, and we need to be willing to entertain new and different ideas. So we can't just assert resilience and say we're built to last, we're too big to fail. I think we need to invite a conversation about what, continued relevance and a continued kind of prominent place in society needs to look like in higher ed to come to a new fruition.
Can you share any examples of higher ed institutions, colleges, or otherwise in Canada or beyond that you feel have demonstrated real resilience in one way or another?
Well, I think, it's what is it to demonstrate resilience? What I would say is I've seen institutions, colleges, departments that have demonstrated efforts that I think are building their resilience. And one example is a very industry focused college that we worked with down in the southern US that was educating professionals in an industry that itself had arguably fallen on hard times. And it took an opportunity to engage its external stakeholders, its students and its graduates and its faculty and staff about what should the future of the industry writ large look like. And really started a very different kind of conversation about that. And then they built their strategy and continue to build their strategy to meet the needs of that future state. So I think that's an example where you've got a college that's not just responding to the kind of urgent, immediate needs of the industry that it serves, but actually reaching into the industry it serves and co-designing an idea for what that future state may be, and then developing the researchers, the programs, et cetera, that meet that future state. And for me, if I were to put money on it, that college would be better positioned for resilience than a peer that's just trying to serve the existing industry as exactly as it is today with all of its kind of archaic problems. Um, and so I think it's that kind of co-building the future with those external and internal stakeholders that is what is setting that college up for resiliency. And you can see it in the numbers. That college is outperforming many other places I can think of, um, in terms of its fundraising efforts, in terms of its grant getting efforts, even at a time when grants are being removed and contracted in so many other places. This particular college is outperforming the norm
Yeah.
massively. And I think that has to do with having reached in and built those relationships and ideas with a much broader audience, and really thinking carefully about who they serve and how they serve them and what tools they have at their disposal.
So, for leaders in higher ed who are listening to this, watching this video, where is somewhere that they can start if they want to begin imagining what greater resilience in their institution would look like, where they have opportunities to tap into?
Well, I mean, I think there are two places they can start. One is a tool that I can recommend to them, and one is just a simple question that I don't think is asked enough in institutions and organizations of all kinds. What I would say in terms of that simple question is, if you were just to walk into the average room in your institution today, full of whoever is in that room, whether they be students or staff or faculty or alumni, external stakeholders, and say, hey, like, what's the problem with what we're working on here or the way we're working on it? I think you would find yourself hearing really simple opportunities to make yourself more resilient and more relevant, the inverse of those problems. So I think, oftentimes when we are working and leading in institutions, we're like, come and give me the smart, clever solutions. And we spend not nearly enough time, although we might feel like we're griping about problems all the time, we don't actually formally give space to the definition of the big juicy problems. I would say just walk around your college or faculty or school today
Mhm.
and ask a bunch of different people, hey, what's the problem here? And if you start to see a theme in that problem, a common thread, I bet you somewhere in that common thread, there's an opportunity to build resiliency
I
by
think,
solving the problem.
I wouldn't be surprised if people listening are really surprised that that was the question you asked, because when we think about resilience, we think about strength and we think about bolstering strength. How often do we think about going out and investigating the weakness, the challenge, and finding a way to turn that into an opportunity? So I think that's really interesting that you went there.
And the truth is, the answer is not nearly enough.
Yeah.
And the reason that it's not nearly enough is because mostly we set up leaders and administrations of institutions to succeed by touting their own success, by saying, like, we are excellent and we've delivered X bazillion dollars in amazing research this year and we have an growing enrollment. And so, like, we teach people that what we want to hear from them about is their successes. And I'm not saying that that's a problem. That's great. I mean, talking about successes and shining a light on that is extremely important, and in some ways is also not done enough. But what we really typically don't do, because we get stuck in that feeling of, oh, we're going to get into the mud and we'll never get into it, is just like allow a productive space to talk about problems that could be fixed. And for me, like, how do you get adaptive and really therefore resilient without dealing with what is? And usually what is conditioned by some real problems. And in this environment where you've got international student caps, where you've got granting bodies disappearing into the night, where you've got huge polarization, there are plenty of problems to talk about. And some of those problems can have very interesting solutions that build resilience.
Now, you mentioned that you had two ideas. One was this
Okay.
question, the other was a tool.
Yeah, so we actually built a set of questions beyond that question called the Institutional Resilience Framework, which we can drop the link to below this video. And the Institutional Resilience Framework is really a tool to evaluate resilience in a few different areas of your college or faculty or whole institution, university, or system. And the questions that we've designed are the questions that we use in our work that have really yielded interesting answers and that have led to really nuanced and different strategies and cultures. Um, and we really felt that in this moment, which feels like such a sort of like world on fire, burning platform kind of a moment where institutional leaders, especially those with progressive ideals about the role of higher education in our society, um, they're looking for really tactile tools to think about how on earth do I slice the scale of what some people are calling a poly crisis in higher education and start being useful or effective as a leader. I mean, I would say that's actually the most common thing that I'm hearing when I talk to people one to one, which I do a lot in my work, especially with folks in higher ed, when I'm talking to people one to one, I'm hearing that feeling of like futility as being like the overwhelming feeling that's coming up in many of the calls, like the I don't know what to do. I'm just going to kind of keep plotting the path. But this is a moment where the institutions that are going to survive and hopefully thrive are not just going to keep kind of moving at status quo. They have to step back. They have to look at the broader landscape. They have to be thinking about what's next, and they have to be designing solutions to meet that what's next, or they're going to be in big trouble. And I think that's something that more people need to be talking about right now.
And that's a challenge, right? Because obviously we're talking about a crisis. We don't often talk about resilience when everything is going well and is easy. And when we're in a crisis, it's also often when we see folks making quick decisions, decisions they make on their own, and maybe not always the most measured decisions either. And so, in this context, and with the goal of building a more resilient institution, what role do inclusive leadership and shared governance and equitable innovation play in building resilience?
I'd have to unpack all of those words because I feel like many of the people that are watching this video will have no idea what those, Anna and Kristen jargony type words are, but I want to explain them. So, I mean, bottom line, resilience cannot be built on the views of a few people for the many anymore. Okay. And in most institutions, in most places around the world, there are still far too few, far too homogenous populations of leaders who are deciding what's relevant, what matters, what problems to solve, and what solutions we're going to invest in to solve those problems. And that might be the single most important problem for the sector and its future, and the single biggest impediment to resilience. What's the antidote to that? The antidote to that is asking so many more people from so many different vantage points across an institution and in the audience that that institution serves. What matters about this place? What do we need to fix that's really broken and not working, and for who? And how might we fix it? Because we need some ideas, and they need to be more plentiful, and they need to be from different vantage points, and they need to serve more people than they're serving today. So that's where those words that you dropped, equitable innovation, inclusive strategy, shared governance, to us, those are the pathways to resilience. Equitable innovation, you can think of it as any beneficial change that reduces unmet need, barriers, bias to expand fairness and equality of opportunity. Well, like if you were to look around your institution today, there are about a bazillion places where you could bring an equitable innovation lens and bring some new voices into the room to help you spot some problems that need to be fixed and to come up with ideas for how to fix them. That would be building resilience. Inclusive strategy, are you going to have a small tenured group of people who are on their way out in an institution and who don't reflect every part of it? Shaping the strategy of your organization and explaining why is your institution uniquely valuable in the world? Or are you going to start with letting everybody define the problems and opportunities before you get to that fine tip pen that is your differentiated strategy? That's inclusive strategy. And then finally, shared governance is a phrase that I feel like everyone I know in higher ed uses. It's like we need more shared governance in this situation. But ask the average person to explain to you what do you mean by shared governance and how exactly do you make it here? And very few people would have an answer for that question because you need processes and structures to make shared governance actually work, especially in an environment like a college or a university or a faculty where power dynamics are rife and where the average way of making decisions is that the most senior, most powerful voices, especially the loud ones, shape most decisions, and a lot of voices are missed in between. So there are pathways to building really robust, easy to implement shared governance processes, but they don't just spontaneously happen. You have to make them. Um, and so these are the three tools in our toolkit for institutional resilience. And the questions that I referred to in our institutional resilience self-evaluation, which is a tool that we're going to drop below, help you think about how well positioned you are in that regard. And the other thing to start thinking about is the financial picture for your organization and how much we're reliant on traditional sources of funding to keep these institutions alive, and how vulnerable we are when those winds change, as they're changing in various places around the world as we speak. and thinking about new ways to bring the necessary resource into our institutions, new pathways to funding our work, and having, more legs on the stool, so to speak,
Yeah.
so that it's sturdier and more resilient. So, anyways, all this to say, there are tools that you can tap into that are extremely valuable. But before you tap into any of those tools, I think it's really helpful to ask yourself a set of really critical questions. And that's what we've built the self-evaluation institutional resilience framework toolkit for, is to really give you a minute to sit down by yourself or with a broad and diverse group of people that work around you in your institution, and to start to bring a critical lens to what are the challenges here? What are the gaps? What are the opportunities? And what might we work on first?
Before we close off, you mentioned before, you take a lot of one-on-one calls with higher ed leaders these days. What one piece of advice do you find yourself giving again and again that you could share with folks listening?
It's a toughie. I give so much advice, most of it unsolicited. Um, I would say a couple things. Number one, it's great to have intent to secure your footing, but intent is not enough. You need a plan and an approach and some principles. You could call it a strategy. Um, the last couple of days, as an example, I've had a number of calls. What kept coming up in those calls was and these happened to be with colleagues in the US, um, mostly departmental heads, but a couple of deans, talking about how many grants have disappeared and what are they going to do to keep their graduate students employed, to keep the projects that are delivering pivotal data and research alive, when money and support for those pieces of work disappears in the night. And there were many beautiful ideas about how to build resiliency that came up in those conversations. And one of the things I kept saying was, okay, like, who else needs to be involved to bring some of those solutions to life? What do you need to pin down and define so that you can pursue those solutions effectively? And I think right now, a lot of people are kind of like feeling their way through crisis. I think this situation demands a much more robust approach and plan. I think like there's so much coming at you. I think you need to think about two or three things that you're really going to double down on or focus on, that are going to yield the kind of, security results that you're looking for in your institutions. I think prior to the last year, 18 months, most institutional leaders didn't need to operate plans like that. They didn't need a financial resilience strategy. They didn't need to come up with 18 different funding sources in case their major funders disappeared. They didn't need to solve these problems. They didn't exist. But now they do. So you need to think about what are the biggest problems standing in the way of our future success, what might happen next. And then I need to think about prioritizing, developing robust approaches quickly and collaboratively, um, to start moving in a forward positive direction. So that was a really long answer to a simple question about advice. Simple advice: don't just act randomly in crisis. Step back, think critically, even if it's only for an hour, and formulate a thoughtful plan. That's my simplest advice. And consult more than one type of person. Consult as many different types of folks as you possibly can, so you can get a wide angle on the problems.
Thanks, Anna. Appreciate it.